Hey folks, what's going on? This is Andy from the Poor Proles Almanac. Right now, I'm also live streaming from Instagram, trying to get folks to jump on. So if you guys are watching and you're not watching on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, I always want to say Instagram because it's the only app that doesn't have live streaming from like Twitch, but it's something that we use a lot. So it's just a weird thing that we can't share. So if you can come jump on, I'm about to X out. You can go to twitch.tv/slash Poor Proles Almanac if you're in the Instagram watching this, or you can hop on our YouTube. Those are your two options. So we're going to get this party started. Let me just click out of my live stream. How you doing, Aisha?
Hi everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm doing it. Good is not a. I was gonna say good, and I was like, ugh. I'm alive.
Yeah, it's late over there, so I don't blame you. It's words start just smashing together. So yeah, thanks for coming on again. I know we had a lot of fun last time. We got totally sidetracked like a bunch of times, so I figured why not just continue the conversation.
Yeah.
So hopefully, oh, hold on one second. You can stream to Instagram from OBS. You just want a second OBS open. I don't know what that means. Like
I
I
have
can
no idea
barely.
what this is either. Yeah.
Yeah, I barely know how to use Twitch or what I'm using. I don't know. I had to pay money to figure out how to stream to multiple things because I don't know how it works. But if you guys are on Facebook, you might not be familiar with Dr. Khan. I'm not sure. Aisha, are you on over on Facebook?
I am, but I am on as like my human normal, like just me personal account.
So
No,
no
I'm
one will
not.
know you from there, theoretically.
Yeah, no, I'm not like a page. I'm just myself. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so she does, if you're not familiar with her work, she does a lot of really cool uh, info pieces on Instagram. And unfortunately, some of that stuff probably ends up making it to Facebook at some
Oh yeah.
point. So you may have seen it. But if not, if you're on Instagram, go check it out. It's really cool. We see eye to eye on a lot of stuff. So it's really cool to see somebody who's more academically trained than I am to articulate better the things that I feel. So I can see that she doesn't like the compliments, but I'm giving them anyway. So what are we talking about today?
Okay, so I hope I'm gonna try to make this a little more. I don't know, like I use infographics on Instagram. It's hard to obviously replicate that exactly on.
You didn't want to do like a slideshow?
Yeah, like a. Oh yeah, that's a good point. It is a slideshow in real life. I was gonna say I don't know how to do it in real life, but people do it all the time. I was like or like a fancy prezi, but I have like a piece of paper and markers if there's ever a real opportunity to like do something. But I think sometimes it helps. So today, I guess we're talking about. Last time we talked a lot about how we can talk to our family members and chosen family. So whatever your friends, your chosen family, and anybody that you care about radical politics and how you actually loop them in, but also how do you do it compassionately and how like what's the line? How can you go about it without being an asshole? I guess. Um, and today we wanted to get a little more detailed and specific on something very I guess, a specific part of the whole conversation, which is how you can apply political theory into your everyday life and relationships. It is part of having this conversation, but it's not just about dialogue and discourse. Getting beyond that and getting to the part where we actually apply it in our day to day.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of people really struggle is I understand these things in theory, but when I try to broach them, especially with like conservative family members and even liberal family members, it can be really hard to engage in a way that's actually like meaningful and helpful, as opposed to just like it turning into a shit throwing competition.
Yeah, and I think last time we talked a lot about how conversation politics in general tends to be a sphere, just another sphere for people to flex their intellectual or moral superiority, and that's the like it is this holier than thou conversations that most people have, and that's kind of what we're used to, which is what we're trying to move away from. And I think maybe we can start with like what's going on in the world. I think that's a opportune real life example of what it's like to not have praxis. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody woke up this morning or even late yesterday and started seeing a lot of news about Russia's ongoing war, well, invasion of Ukraine. I don't want to say war that implies both sides are equal, um, but invasion, imperialist invasion of Ukraine. And I think most of this information, if you are on Instagram or any social media and you follow certain accounts, and this is how you get your like day to day political enlightenment, you probably saw tons of posts from a bunch of leftist accounts jumping on the gun, trying to dissect the political situation in the region, give all of these like commentaries about the history and this and that. And I don't know, but when I saw that, it was just a little bit like not because it's not important to understand history or not important to like have a breakdown about what's been going on in the region, but I think what was very obvious was all accounts, most accounts that are probably on your feed, including mine, are not on the ground and do not have to face the real life consequences of being in a war. And the people that do have to pay the consequences are people like us that don't have the safety of being able to like post political takes while they're being bombed. And again, that's not to say that it's not important to use this opportunity for political education, but I think it's like, what are you educating about? Because I saw a bunch of political takes that were just like, oh, let's just defend the actions of Russia because Russia is anti-American imperialism and blah 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 blah. Again, all of that just showed to me, or shows us in general, that whenever people focus so much on governments and politicians and entities that are not real, that are entirely made up, that they're so removed from the day-to-day reality of what people living in that area go through. And I promise you, we can relate to the average working class person in Russia and Ukraine way more than you can to any politician, including politicians here, obviously in the United States, and also politicians in Russia. So I thought that was a very interesting. I mean, obviously we timed this for that reason, but it was just this very real life manifestation of what people here just of having the privilege to be able to talk about it and have these intellectual discourses.
Yeah, it's funny because like not only did we have the Ukraine thing today, but for me personally, if you saw on the like making its way around on Instagram and Facebook was the Nazis marching in Providence, and that was like a couple miles from where I grew up. So it's just like, it's one of those things, like it happens in Portland and, in these
Mm-hmm.
other very specific instances, but to see it like in a street that you've like driven down 100 times is like also very like jarring in a way that like you feel it's much more closer to home when it's like I know that building behind these Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
That's a different experience, even if you understand it's happening in your country, your state, even to have
Yeah.
that intimacy with it, I think forces you to engage in the content in a different way.
Yeah, and I think, and I associated.
I can turn you
I
up.
can move. Can you hear me? I can talk louder if it's
I just turned you up, so hopefully that
okay.
should fix
Perfect.
it.
Oh, perfect. I think yeah, for me too. I mean, I lived in Moscow for 3.5 years when I was younger. When I was in, I think I was in middle school. So I still have a lot of friends that are living in different parts of Ukraine, especially Kiev and Russia as well. And it's interesting. Just I think yeah, like what you said, because talking to people on the ground on both sides that are just regular working class people. Um, it's on one hand, I have friends that had to like flee their homes overnight that are trying to find shelter while there's bombs dropping. But on the other hand, you also have people that are opposing and pushing against their own authoritarian governments in Russia, trying to add pressure so against the war. I mean, what that shows us is that there's a lot more solidarity across borders, and that none of these constitutions are real, but people are, and therefore it's much more in our interest to actually listen to real people rather than defend institutions, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also, especially like as anarchists, I think we have a hard time engaging in conversations when there's two bad actors, and in some cases multiple, three bad actors, and it's like, well, the easy answer is just to say all of them are bad, therefore I don't want, like, none of these are
Yeah.
solutions, and just to not really have a solution.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's important. I kind of thought about how to go about like praxis. So I think even when you see something happen in the world like this, I mean, obviously you go through the wave of trying to understand what's happening, and then you understand, okay, this is complex, there's no binaries, and that's good. And understanding that there's, in this case, like three bad actors, the third being the United States. But in general, I think with praxis, the next step is examining, okay, so if so many, and all of these things are happening every day, and this is not just, it's important to not be reactionary to sensationalist news cycles, but also constantly be actively understanding how things manifest, I guess. And I guess the first thing is for us to ask ourselves what the root cause of oppression is. So where does everything actually come from? And identifying roots allows you to conjure effective solutions. And the one thing I think, if anybody really, I mean, and you don't need a lot of history or knowledge or theory to even get these answers. It's to just sit down and realize that there's so much that's happened across history, and the commonalities that you notice are that systems are left in place and individuals are sort of plugged and chugged and replaced. But what that leads to is a system ultimately just being reformed and adapting to its time and becoming a little bit more palatable for its time, but still enabling the same oppression. And I think so that's exactly what happened to colonialism. And when I'm talking about colonialism, I'm referring to 20th century European colonialism, but that just became what we have today, which is capitalism in the form of nation states. So I guess it's that's realizing that gets us to realize, okay, there's these structures of power that are in place, and then you can simplify it even more and say, okay, what are power structures? They're just systems that are hierarchical, that have a way that allows people on the top to easily accumulate power, which today looks like wealth, and therefore political and other forms of power, to be able to exploit everybody else, the majority of everybody else. And if any system like that is left in place, which is literally what by design is any nation state, like any country, is designed to do that, it is impossible for there to be any form of equity when you have a pyramid. And I think that's where all of us come in, because then the question is, okay, but what do I do? So I have an understanding of like, okay, these systems are in place, these systems are bad, we need to change, we need to abolish these systems and put something else in place that works. But where do everyday people come in? And I think that's realizing what makes systems so powerful, right? Like, why are they here? If there's a general understanding around the world that these systems don't serve us and they're oppressing us on a day to day, what makes them so powerful? And that's that we've all internalized actual cultural norms and beliefs and little and big ways of living our life and engaging with each other, which are the cultural values that uphold these systems. And that's what makes it possible to keep them in place. And therefore, if we've bought into all these cultural values that are like capitalist and colonial, that keep these systems in place, then change literally means we have to do the work we need to do to like unlearn and untangle all of the values that we've internalized and practice ways of divesting from these systems in any small way possible. And I think that's where praxis comes in. So that's essentially what praxis is. It's trying to apply the values of liberation and values of this hypothetical model of a non-hierarchical, equitable, just society in your like life now, today, without having to like wait for this tomorrow to come. Because that's how it comes when you actually do this in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, and that raises the question of, like, how do you do that? Like, I think a lot of people will hear that and say, "I agree, I understand," and then they get off the internet and they're not surrounded by people with the same political values, and then it becomes really hard to engage in a way that's meaningful, because there's so much to it in terms of how we talk about these subject matters and how we relate to people around us, which is reinforced by capitalism, but
Mm-hmm.
also like the educational components and all of these other things that we ask for people to unlearn when they don't want to, and we make knowledge unnecessarily inaccessible. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
Yeah, so
I
there's a lot to that, and I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think today we wanted to take some time to give like tangible examples of like what are some ways you can actually do this. So first, I think it helps me to think, okay, if I'm talking about capitalism, which is literally I think the global root of all evil because it makes any sort of injustice profitable. What upholds capitalism in our day to day? So with capitalism, you're thinking of internalized capitalist values. So and what that looks like is individualism essentially. So it's living and this is ideas that you have that you've been socialized with since birth that guide how you act and how you carry yourself in this world and how you forge relationships. So capitalism, in order for that to be a system that's in place, it needs and requires for us to believe in competition. For example, that competition is natural and that we're all supposed to compete with each other, and fabricates scarcity, makes people believe that there's not enough for everyone, and therefore the only way to be safe and secure is to be able to compete with each other and in this dog eat dog world. So that's one of these like cultural values that people are fundamentally brainwashed with straight propaganda over their lives. And a simple way where that's done is like K through 12 education. You have to essentially compete with your peers that you love and you care about, and your success inherently has to come at the expense of them and their failure, because you're taught that not everybody can succeed. And these kind of systems are set up to essentially normalize a lot of really uncompassionate behavior that we practice with each other. Another example is transactionality. So um, capitalism commodifies everything. So it literally tries to put a dollar sign on things like human life and the planet, and tries to quantify their worth, including people. And basically, you're born. You don't choose to be born, but you just are. And then you're told that you don't have the right to exist, and you're not guaranteed survival, which means you're not given food, water, shelter, community, and healthcare. And you're told that you have to earn it. And the way that people earn it is essentially sell their bodies in the form of labor and deserve or earn the right to survive. But again, the playing field is not actually equal like you're led to believe. And a lot of people are born into wealth and a lot of people are born into poverty, and that sort of determines your trajectories. So I guess really understanding the values that we internalize since birth, lets you then to examine, what if I lived my life without subscribing to these values? What does that look like? And so if, because we just talked about anarchists, a huge idea of, again, within the framework of anarchy, is any kind of oppression needs these hierarchical structures to exist, where it's really easy to hoard power at the top. And that's what capitalism is. It allows for the 1% to be able to accumulate and hoard all this wealth, to be able to exploit the 99%. But that also looks like how we work and act in our daily lives. So chances are the niches of society you're involved in, from work to your school, are all hierarchical structures. And these are the same exact structures that existed in 20th century European colonialism. So that's a structure of academia, that's a structure of medicine, that is a structure of taxation, that is a structure of electoral politics. That is where the police come from. That is where prisons come from. So every little system that we interact with in our day-to-day like every single system are still the same systems that have been intact since colonialism. So nothing's really changed except the people have changed within them, right? So one small way that we practice this culturally is the idea of hierarchical love. So I drew like a little pyramid, but I mean, what that
Better than
looks
I
like.
could do.
But what that looks like is the idea that there's some forms of love that are more important than others, and generally it places romance on top and deprioritizes everything else, like family, friends, and mentors, and other really complex relationships that people have with people. And obviously that creates power dynamics, and leads to a lot of unhealthy, toxic relationships. But obviously, it's meant, what that ultimately does, it breaks solidarity within communities, because communities are stronger when you have a really strong support system. So an example of Praxis is, okay, if hierarchies don't work, then what might work is not having hierarchies. It really is sometimes just that simple. So that's the idea of non-hierarchical systems, and what that would look like for you in your day-to-day, I guess, is to have, like, instead of having a pyramid, then having just like buckets of relationships where, you know, you have romantic love, and that's one thing, and then you have your friends and you have your family, and all of them are equally important to each other, and they just have different roles. And then that creates a wide support net and a safety net for people. And ultimately, that's how strong communities are free, because they're able to protect themselves and fend for themselves, and do not have to rely on oppressive governments to do so. So that's one example, but it also, the same principle of hierarchy can then look like, even if you have any amount of power at work. So, for example, if you're in a leadership role, if you are in academia and you are able to mentor other people, you can structure your environment and how you do things, instead of doing this, to do more of this. So if you're part of an organization, not having a hierarchical system of organizing things where one person runs things and people are placed in a way where they have more power than everybody else. Um, and I think thinking about all of this, ultimately what that means is you change how you live, and you change how you go about your day to day, and you end up approaching people with a lot more compassion. So if we think about abolition, for example, so prisons and police and the military and psychiatry and all carceral institutions, in order to exist and be as powerful as they are, they have to convince us, and we have to buy into the idea of the culture of punishment, that punishment is a way that we need to treat each other. And again, an example, going down the same line of logic, we do this since we're little. We're taught in schools that punitive measures are the way to raise kids, right? And this happens from the family unit, where children are punished, and negative uh, reinforcement is way more used to be able to raise kids than compassion, and then treating kids like with equity, I guess, with agency. And then from school, you go on to encounter the exact same dynamics with your workplace or with whatever in your life. So um, again, we punish each other in relationships. We're taught to go have dynamics where accountability, and this is part of like neoliberal cancel culture, I guess, where the word accountability has been completely destroyed and is now synonymous with, um, oddly, doing the same thing that prisons and police would do, which is to discard people to the fringes of society and abandon them, and then just like literally extricate them for making a mistake, or for basically stepping out of line. And ultimately, what accountability is supposed to be is something that's actually really beautiful and compassionate, and something to run towards, not run away from. But in order to do that, you can't have the same dynamics of a culture of punishment. So, what would your life look like if you didn't think of responding to harm in different ways? If you're harmed, or if you harm someone else, or if you see harm happening around you, but don't use punishment in that context, what does that look like? So usually what that looks like is actually enabling people in your life to grow and still being there as they make mistakes,
Yeah.
and creating space for them.
Yeah, whenever I think of like the buckets that you were talking about, I think about like the concept of heterarchy, and the idea that you can have, basically you can temporarily give power to people, but there's a social understanding that that power is temporary, like based on knowledge and skill sets, like
Mm-hmm.
talking about like COVID, for example. Like the
Mm-hmm.
idea of heterarchy would say like the people that are most qualified to speak on the subject matter have the authority temporarily to give guidance on what we should do, but it's
Mm-hmm.
understood that power is given up quickly. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that whole concept is really important to understand. And like when there's uncomfortable positions or situations, to understand leadership isn't a bad thing. The importance is that we understand that leadership is temporary, and it's given
Mm-hmm.
because of a skill, not because of, the alpha male, or an
Exactly.
institutional understanding of power.
Yeah, and exactly, and changing your understanding of what, I guess, like you said, leadership and power really means, right? So under the if you're applying values of abolition and anarchy into what power would mean, everybody would have it. That's the idea. Then it no longer means that you don't have to have a power dynamic to have power, right? when we speak of power, that can just mean agency and sovereignty and the ability to do something for yourself, and to ask for what you need. That can be power. And power, removing power from the equation that's normally used, which is power over someone else. So it's almost like we've normalized aspiring to what we call climbing the ladder, right? So we've aspired to gaining career mobility and getting to the top, and we think that that's normal. Like we talk about that like that's something that's commendable. Like people are complimented for having quote unquote ambition, right? But ambition can just be having like a really bold vision of creating a more equitable society and then doing everything you can in your day to day to strengthen your relationships. But when but the way ambition normally is used is within the framework of capitalism and colonialism, which is getting to the top so you can be side by side with your oppressor. And I think we don't even think about how all of this is so normal and defines what we not just do, but how we think and how we like shape our hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
That just makes me think about like, this institutional piece. Like, for example, like Bill Gates is like a really interesting person to talk about because I genuinely think he thinks he's a good person.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think Jeff Bezos thinks he's a good person, but I think Bill Gates actually thinks he's a good person. But because of and I think outside of capitalism, he would probably be a good person. But
Mm-hmm.
because of the way power dynamics play out in a capitalist society, his ability to operate in a meaningful, good way is basically rendered impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's when we talk about these ideas of like, we want to get rid of dismantle capitalism and blah, 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 it's very easy to just like target people that have been wealthy and say like they're a problem when really they're just filling the role of somebody who is going to have that money, whether or not it's them. And like
Mm-hmm.
that person themselves isn't really that important. It's the role within the capitalist system that is important.
Yep.
And like I think sometimes we take away that humanity, and like that's not really helpful in the conversation. And I think if we think about it at
Mm-hmm.
this bigger picture of this institutional and structural um, piece, then we can engage with the content in a way that's like, okay, if you got rid of Bill Gates, then what? Like that doesn't solve anything.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that goes back to you can't just replace individuals in a fundamentally inequitable system that's meant for power grabs, and then expect change to come, which is what we do in everything, right? Like from diversity inclusion efforts at institutions like companies and academic institutions to politicians and electoral politics to literally just thinking that we can have different types of rich people and celebrities to be able to like um, give us more power. And I think ultimately all of that then goes back to okay, so what are again examining what are ways that we're exploited. So what are we made to believe since birth in different and again all of this happens in different places in our life where it's reinforced. So some of it does, and a lot of it happens in our families, how we're raised, how we enter relationships. A lot of it happens in school as part of education. A lot of it happens in the workplace as part of learning how and what work is. And a lot of it happens with the media and entertainment. So how you consume information and what you read and what you listen to and what you watch. Another big thing I thought of in terms of praxis is the idea of binaries. I think that's something that's like beat into us since we're kids. The idea that we live in a world, I guess, where there's like there we go, where there's like two sides to everything, right? Like we're just told a lot of it. Then that idea of a binary is taken and exploited in order to get like unquestioning public support for wars, for example. So that comes from like the us versus them mentality. But a lot of times on an individual level, that also looks like us looking at people as good people or evil people, right? As opposed to just really complex human beings that make mistakes and do a lot of good and are capable of growth given the right conditions. And it also looks like other binaries that are social constructs that have been created in order to basically create hierarchies then that divide people. When we take that and then we think about okay, so if binaries don't work, then what can I do in my day to day? And I guess that basically just looks like understanding that we live in a very non-binary complex universe, And that leaves you to open possibilities about how you incorporate information, for example, and how you approach people, right? And it forces you to understand that there's so many variables and factors go into why someone does what they do. So what that can look like is, for example, understanding that violence is contextual, that people in the right condition or the wrong conditions, in the appropriate social conditions, can all do harm, right? Like I was not given a choice of the identities that I was handed when I was born. It was just something that happened by luck and probability, and same for everybody else. So if no one is actually actively choosing and everything is driven by luck, then that means you can't pin actions that come from a product of all of the things that have happened to them in their environment solely on them, right? So this is the entire basis of what abolition is, that people are capable of a lot of good and bad if they're in the social conditions of oppression that are putting everything on them to be able to act in a way where they have to act in such a manner, and no one would if they could otherwise. So it allows you to be, I guess, more compassionate and approach things with a little bit of humility. Probably that's maybe the most important thing. Like we talked a lot about this last time, building self-awareness in different ways. And a lot of political praxis is understanding why do you believe the things that you believe, who led you to believe them, questioning everything, and trying to understand your own role in upholding these systems and how you do this in your day to day, so you can actually do something different about it. And again, we talk about transactionality with capitalism. What that looks like is being non-transactional in your relationships. So not doing something nice for someone just because then you expect them to do something nice for you, but just doing it because you care about them, and that's what we do. And that changes the whole dynamic of how relationships are set up, right? I think another thing that I think about is all oppression relies on social constructs or made up categories that divide people. And I just drew and really the point of all of that is to place us into different boxes. And when we're in each of these boxes, it's really difficult for us to be in solidarity with each other, especially when we go into this with this us versus them mentality. And all the while knowing that none of these things are real, right? But they've shaped our experiences, and they've shaped our experiences in terms of how we face the systems that we face. Some people are advantaged and some people are disadvantaged. But really, now we're understanding that all of it is to get us to feel like we have less in common with our neighbor than we actually do. Because if we actually understood and walked across and talked to other people, even if they have differing values to us or differing politics to us, then we would probably learn that we have so much in common, and we all share common oppressors, and we're fighting the same cause. But it's so much harder to do that when you fundamentally wouldn't even talk to someone who was XYZ identity, right?
Yeah, and that's something I think we see a lot with like the left versus right binary here in the United States that doesn't address like there's this very strange dynamic with the left about like class solidarity, but also like very um overwhelming focus on exclusivity of like
Yes.
who is worth saving or who is worth fighting for, who do I want in my communities versus
Yeah.
like just engaging with where you are and what exists around you.
Yeah, and I mean something that made me think about, and obviously, like the idea of intersectionality is really important to where we understand that with every marginalized identity, people have like another boulder on their back to deal with. But again, that doesn't mean there's nothing in common that you have even with people that have more privilege than you do, right? But it just means that someone with more privilege can leverage that to be able to give it away. And an example that I learned in my day to day was folks that have more means and are, for example, not necessarily like elite, but rich and are having a lot more privilege. Obviously, we have blanket judgments on that, but then something that kind of forced me to even see something with compassion for that for people like that is childhood trauma, and realizing that, okay, well, children are probably the most vulnerable, marginalized population around the world. And if a child is born into an incredibly abusive family and this is all they've known, which is all they've known is like terror and fear and have never had any sort of safety and security and stability, then them growing up having a little bit more money or being white doesn't actually mean anything to this child. This child's day to day is hell. And ultimately, what it does mean, though, is as someone who has more agency when they're older, they do have a responsibility to be able to do something about their own life and to be able to take the privilege that they have to do something about it. So that doesn't rid them of accountability, but I think it got me to understand that, okay, well, this person's going to grow up to pretty much do anything and everything they probably need to do to get their parents to love them because they were genuinely afraid that no one will. And that might get them to do a lot of really shitty things. But then I had to realize, okay, I did shitty things for the same reason, even though because I didn't have a lot of means and I'm not, I don't have privilege, maybe I wasn't able to cause the level of harm as someone would given their position. So, but that still made me understand, okay, it's never a yes or no. It's really
Yeah.
hard to know things all good, all bad.
Yeah, and I think that points to like the reality of the world we live in, especially folks that live in like predominantly white communities. And you talk about like racial injustice, and they genuinely don't understand what you're talking about. And it comes from a place of like just living in a bubble. And it's like
Yes,
that comes with a lot of layers of why they live in that bubble, and what their limitations to exposure are. And
right. And that
that's
everybody used to be a kid sometimes, and I think people don't realize that. I don't think people like. I know it's so obvious that everybody at some point was a baby, but like, but when we're having conversations with people, I don't think people realize at some point this person was a child that had no agency on their day to day and did not get to decide what values that they were brainwashed with in their family, had no choice of who they could talk to, where they could go, what they could learn, and what amount of compassion they could have for certain people. But they were drilled with a certain set of values every single day. And not only were they, given the set of values to imbibe, they were told that they have to believe in these things in order to be loved and successful. And when you're a child, that's all you want. You don't care about money. You don't care about fighting people that are different than you. All you want is to belong and to feel like you're worthy of something. And you will do anything to get that love. And even if that means being racist, being sexist, being homophobic, being transphobic, and I know I'm saying that, but that's exactly, it's important to think about why people believe the things they believe, I think. Because nobody
yeah.
has these stark views for no reason, right?
Yeah, and that's something you see come out, like, you'll uh, again, I grew up in a fairly blue collar area, and like there are plenty of racist, like very openly, like would say casual things about minorities, but then there would be like, their best friend is black, and you're like, how? And he's like, well, he's not like those people, and it's like, okay,
Right,
let's talk about that because
right,
that's a really
right.
important conversation.
Right,
And
right. And that's where you realize, wait, so they do have the capability to basically show up in different ways than they're talking about, but at the same time, and it then goes back to how the leftists, right? So it's like a lot of us then take politics and it just becomes random stuff that we say out loud to say it, to say that we believe in XYZ. Oh, but this is the exception, but we believe in XYZ. And the whole reason we do that is, again, this whole us versus them, because it allows you to have a sense of belonging with a certain side and then look at someone else as completely different than you. And it goes back to belonging, and that's why I talk so much about like our like fundamental needs, which aren't just food and water. It's a need to belong and to be loved and cared for. And so many things that we do are from that place, and are from the place where we've been told in order to get love and care, this is what you have to do in life. And that's why so many people are like working class but hardcore supporters of capitalism, because they've been told that at some point they're able to aspire to climb the ladder and get to the top, and they will have all of these things that they've never had their whole life, which is at the end of the day never really all of the material fluff, but it really is just a feeling of being happy. And
yeah,
happiness is tied inextricably to material possessions under capitalism. um, so I think for me it's looked like thinking about I guess really, really understanding what makes us do the things we do and think the things we think. And if we're able to understand that, then we're able to empathize and really have compassion for anybody. And that changes how you talk to people, that changes how you show up. And for example, I've been in like really small rural towns in different parts of the South where, again, folks have these really conservative views that they're very open about, and at the same time they treat me well, right? And they're able to have certain conversations with me that I didn't otherwise think they'd be able to have, but that's because they genuinely care about this human being in front of them. And it's so much harder for them to pin these views that they believe on me, because now there's a person.
Yeah.
And that, but that means that literally goes back to that. Then the antidote, I guess, for oppression is to actually talk to your neighbor and talk to people and connect with them, even if on the superficial end you're like, ooh, I don't know about this person.
Yeah, I mean, like I think about the idea of community and like the alienation that we felt over the last, I think, 40 or so years that just got accelerated with technology and then further got accelerated with COVID. That's really kind of decimated what community feels like. And between things like
Yes,
capitalism moving in
yes,
and
yes.
I mean, not that capitalism didn't exist, but like the
No, but I think it is the advent of technology. I think that's changed everything. I think, I mean, the Netflix documentary "Social Dilemma" actually explains this pretty well, showing that like the social media space, the virtual space of commodifying people's ideas, it's become this echo chamber where everybody gets on there to validate themselves and whatever pre-existing beliefs they have, because that's just how the algorithm works. And at the same time, it prevents you from really seeing and hearing and understanding people that are different than you. So and then like you said, with COVID, but also before that, I think we relied on so much of our lives being virtual. Like, we relied on having these like curated profiles where we network on LinkedIn, where we like connect with our friends on Facebook, where we pretend like we're perfect and happy on Instagram. And all of that involves us being on our phones and our laptops, which means that we're alone and we're isolated within four walls when we do that, and we're away from everybody else, right? And essentially it's created less and less time that people spend in real life with each other. And while obviously a pandemic is one reason to do that, but at the same time, that was our culture always.
yeah,
And I think so
it
many
just made it
people just,
more obvious. Yeah.
yes, it made it so obvious that a lot of people were actually, well, it made it more obvious in that when you're told you're not allowed to see each other, then it actually makes you think about the value of seeing each other.
Yeah.
But that's something we've always taken for granted, and we've always thought that virtual communities can replace real life communities, and they absolutely cannot.
No. No, and like, there's always this idea of like, oh, we'll just start a commune or whatever. And it's like, okay, like you're gonna go make friends like these people you've met on the internet and you're gonna go buy a piece of land with them. Like, you already live in a town. Why can't you just like get to know your neighbors? And
Yeah,
like,
yeah, and talking to people about, and I think so much of it. That's why I focus on getting to know people in terms of like what made them them. So talking to them about their families, about their childhood experiences, and just the day to day struggles they have, because that's what you can 100% connect on, regardless of the political beliefs that someone can have. And I think once I changed even the rhetoric of how I approach political conversations, and didn't come from, hey, I know more than you, let me save you, or some variation of, I'm so much better than you, and you're wrong, and you're basically just a bad, terrible person. And approached it from, hey, let me try to understand what you've been through, because I'm not just here to convert you or to shove my values down your throat. That's not the purpose of this interaction. The purpose of this interaction is for me to genuinely get to know you,
yeah,
because every human being deserves that, and try to understand where you come from, and then basically find solidarity with you, then share my own experiences about how we actually do experience the same thing. And
yeah,
you might have not been told that in the words that I'm using now, but that doesn't mean we're not actually already in solidarity, you know?
yeah. It's an uncomfortable conversation, and I think the internet has made us very bad at those.
Oh, well, yeah, and I mean that's why I think really think about what social media is doing to us is really important, because social media, again, the echo chambers drives you. Um, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, it said something about reloading the page. Weird.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
was trying to clear a comment.
huh. So I think social media drives, because of being in echo chambers, because you're seeing what you already believe in, what you already agree with. What it leads to is people getting on Instagram to scroll really rapidly past real like human joy and suffering, right? Like there is someone on the other side, and these are issues about real people, but the rate at which we've been desensitized to human suffering, and we've also had decreased attention span, so we're just like constantly just like doing this, and really then what social media makes you do is just look for validation. And so look for posts that you like and that make you feel good and that make you feel validated, because again, in your real life, you probably are missing that in different ways, right? Like you probably don't work in a workplace that's very validating. You're already stripped of worth and value, and you're told that you have to, you know, quote unquote, work to survive. And a lot of which involves doing something that you don't want to do, or most of the fruits of your labor are not actually given to you, right? And then you have relationships that might be unsatisfactory, and that's all because of like the hierarchical model of love. And then you're online searching for anything that makes you feel good and a little bit better about yourself, and that's totally understandable. But at the same time, what that means is then you confront information, or you happen to like run into information that breaks the algorithm, where it disagrees with you, and it's something that's fundamentally against whatever beliefs you already hold. Then you just, you know, rage in the comments, or like ignore it and look past it, or unfollow the person. And that's what we've been primed and trained to do by these algorithms, essentially. And it makes it very easy to stay stuck, and makes it very difficult to grow and change and evolve and actually incorporate new information that's inducing cognitive dissonance. And I think what you talked about, the discomfort, is that's a real thing, right? Like and that's what capitalism does, that I think is quote unquote like brilliant or whatever, but not commending it. But our whole lives were in fight or flight. Our whole lives were in search of validation and love, because we are so fundamentally deprived of that under capitalism. All of us are. The moment you're told you don't deserve to live and survive on this planet, you have to do all these random things in order to gain that right, even though nobody asked to be here. That fundamentally is a dehumanizing world to exist in, where you've been told you don't matter. And you've been told you don't matter in several different ways as a child. And ultimately, then you're just primed to desperately search that. But then again, the antidote to that is building that, then is going back to your communities, is going back to your relationships, and trying to essentially revamp that love, revamp that validation, getting validation from your peers, getting validation from your loved ones, getting validation from people you care about, instead of seeking it online. And then also being okay with another one of these, like when we talked about like the two sides, the binaries, we shove all of the world and everything that exists within it into positive and negative. That's another huge binary, and feelings are part of that. So we run towards things that make us feel good. And again, our feelings are very deceptive, right? Things that make you feel good aren't necessarily actually good in real life, and as in they're not objectively good. But at the same time, run from emotions like disappointment, sadness, grief, guilt, shame, embarrassment, humiliation, all of these feelings, because we just think that there's something that make us feel so much pain that we want to run from. But pain is actually and discomfort is the only way we learn. I think any process of really learning is never comfortable, because it means first you have to understand that acknowledge that either you didn't know something at all and then learn new information, or the stuff that you knew was completely false, and that you've been living under that premise and probably doing a lot of things that are wrong under that premise, and then replace it with this new information that gives you a better understanding of the world. And that's going to be very uncomfortable, because as human beings, we're going to get all these feelings of like guilt and shame. But I think if not for social media, if you were in real life and someone in front of you, so not a post, right? Like, but a real human being tells you something that makes a lot of sense, is very logical, is objectively reasonable, but at the same time, it contends with the views that you hold, you're so much more likely to sit there, stay there, which means that it's going to force you to stay with your negative feelings. And it's okay, and you'll feel bad. You'll probably remember all the shitty things you did, but then this person will tell you it's okay, they did it too, and now they know better, and then you're just going to move on. And that is not at all what happens in social media, right? It's
No.
like, this is incredible. So if you can just create the things that we're deprived of, it's almost like, and it's not easy. It's really hard to live in the matrix and divest from the matrix at the same time while you're forced to exist within it. But I think that's where you kind of explore, where can I divest from capitalist colonial values in my life? And then decide, okay, if I can have a job that allows me to feed myself, but is doing the least harm possible. So maybe not work for well, a Wall Street
Raytheon.
company. Yeah, maybe not like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing, or just like thinking about how can I do the least amount of harm. And then if you do have any amount of intergenerational wealth, redistributing it, for example, because you might have been born into a lot of privilege that you did not ask for nor chose. But at the same time, it does matter that when you realize you do have that, you can give it away in different forms. So that's where that agency comes in. And there you can decide, even on your day to day, okay, I do have to be forced to go to the market and buy food and buy clothes and buy all these things. So there's everything in this world in many ways is transactional, but I don't have to do that with my family and friends. I don't have to do things for them in order for them to give me something in return. And so I think you can choose how and where to divest. And the whole idea is eventually over time, more people are going to do this, and you're going to be able to divest more and more from capitalist colonial systems. And eventually it's going to hit a critical mass where these systems don't actually have the power that they currently have.
Yeah. I think what we talked about it last time, this idea that like collapse will probably look more like as communities strengthen, that
Yeah,
the government just withers away, and it's not going to be like, I know that was like the whole idea like with communism, is that the government withers away, but like in reality it'll be because the state loses its legitimacy. And with climate change
right,
and all these other things, it chances are it will just lose the power to do those things as people don't need it.
right. And there is no binary of like a oppressive world and a post-revolutionary world. That doesn't actually, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like we're not all going to show up tomorrow and burn down the White House,
No
right?
general
Like,
strikes.
yeah, like it doesn't happen and occur that rapidly. What happens is there's a lot of gradual sustainable change, but any amount of change has to be sustainable, right? And what that looks like is basically us looking at what do we have, what is real in this world. And I think that goes back to praxis. So if oppression relies on making up a bunch of stuff and telling you to believe it, then the antidote to that is going back to what you know to be real. So what you know to be real is not all of these social constructs that are fed to you, but people and land and animals and things that you can hear, see, touch, and feel, or like whatever senses, right? That people can interact with their world in different ways. And ultimately, then you going back to the real and trying to protect what's real is ultimately the more important thing. Like your company is not real, your academic institution is not real, borders are not real, nation states are not real. So none of these things are like laws of biology, chemistry, and physics, such that if they did not exist, the world would fall apart or it's impossible to take them down, right? But how we exist in terms of, for example, needing community, that actually is a very biological principle. Like we all do need each other to survive. We all need to be cared for, and we all need love in different capacities, and we all need to be supported by different types of people, not just caregivers, in order for us to thrive. Right? That is a real confinement in terms of like what it takes, I guess, to exist in this universe. So there are certain things that are real, but I think ultimately it goes back to also thinking about, okay, if there's no moment of revolution that's coming, and then everything's going to be perfect right after, then it looks like you just creating pieces of that world now. You creating little pieces of that world in your day to day, and in these little moments of liberation and compassion, there's going to be more of those moments, and eventually it might be most of your day. And eventually that might be most systems you interact with. They are actually equitable because you made them so. And that's why it's important to think about the power you have in your life. And I mean, not like, ooh, like inner like self-love and valid. I mean, that's maybe important, but like, no, I mean like literal power, like in your day to day, what power do you hold over other people? Because we all do. And then thinking about how you can leverage it to give it away and to decentralize and to redistribute it. And ultimately, like you just mentioned, what it looks like is if we know that our communities are real, our communities are made up of these individual friendships and relationships and individual connections between people. And the most you can do then is strengthen those connections, which would ultimately scale up and strengthen the entire community. And when your community is strong, you like that's what we talked about. You would be less reliant and be less forced to work for an employer you hate, less forced to enter a healthcare system and go to a hospital that is ultimately exploiting people. But now you might know someone that actually does the same thing, but actually cares about people. So it's really thinking about the ways that you can serve people and also be able to think about how you exist in your day to day without the values of the systems that are oppressive.
Yeah, and I think it's really important when we're having this conversation, like where it's one of those things I think it's easy to listen to and say, like, oh, that's something that sounds good in theory, but like it could never actually happen because like these are things that have happened.
Hmm.
When we think about like, the post Dust Bowl in the United States, when farms would go up for auction and the community would protect the farms from being sold to people that were
Hmm.
outside of the community, so that basically people could buy back their farms for a dollar instead of getting, pushed out by banks. So it's
And
not
this
like
does happen like everywhere. Like, so there are communities that exist already with a lot of these frameworks, right? And I mean, abolition obviously talks about as you abolish systems that are oppressive, you have to simultaneously create systems that provide community care. But there are, for example, I think about like, I don't know, like my village in India that is a very small town where everybody knows each other and everybody like the people that are making your food and the people that are making your clothes and the people that are like everybody knows each other and they do have an equal value to each other, so the doctors in the community don't actually make a lot more than the sanitation workers. And ultimately there are places that exist that have applied these value systems and tried as much as possible to divest from governments. And I think it's interesting to see that we have so many examples, but it does take a certain level of you believing that you can do this in your life.
yeah. And I think what's interesting too about what the example you gave is my guess is that community isn't developed from theory. Like this is community just being community. It's not because they read
No,
like
yeah.
fucking Kropotkin or something. Like no
Yeah,
one
no, and
walked
I think
around with
that's
the bread
important.
book.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe for folks that know, like I'm talking about, it's a town, it's a coastal town called Bangray near Mangalore in the state of Karnataka in South India, and there are parts of South India that are like anarchist communist states that are very that's like political parties are very open about that, but I mean, literally, if you talk to politics to folks in our town, they're probably just going to be very confused about all of the words that we're using, and they're just going to be like, "What the fuck is?" But at the same time, these people are kind and compassionate people in their day to day. They check up on each other all the time. They spend so much time with each other. There's only one road that cuts through the whole community, so intentionally, they've prevented a lot of urbanization and urban development. And at the same time, the models of care that they have are so rooted in like traditions and values and keeping people safe and fending for each other and protecting each other. And none of this requires, like you just said, like none of them have read any political theory.
Yeah.
um, and they haven't had to. The thing is, if you really like think about the things that matter, you will arrive at the same conclusions.
Yeah. And like it just like it's one of those things, like, I understand, like, the importance of theory for a lot of people, but, like, to me and, like, the way I came around to, like, becoming an anarchist wasn't around, like, the theory itself, but, like, do you genuinely believe people are good or bad people? And are people
Yeah,
genuinely, like, going to be considerate of other people outside of the oppression of capitalism? And if you believe those 2 things, like, there's
yeah.
only one solution, really.
And I think for me it was also eventually having to be forced to like deal with my own childhood trauma and all of these things that made me realize, okay, I've made a lot of mistakes, I've done a lot of stupid things, I have absolutely hurt people, so if I'm capable of better, then I, how do I gatekeep and draw a line on when someone isn't, like when there's a limitation on like where they're no longer incapable of being a better human being if they have the right conditions. So I think it really got me to understand, and it takes a certain level of humility. I think that's why I talk about like the moral superiority complex that a lot of people have on the left and in the West, especially, and by that I mean like Americas or colonial countries, where people genuinely use politics as a way to shut people down and pretend like they know everything and talk over them and be like, oh my God, you should just convert to everything I believe in because I hold all the answers to everything.
Yeah.
and and if that and I think that obviously, oops, sorry, um and obviously that inextricably never, I guess, gets me to think about even like I obviously definitely found like grassroots organizing as a space for me to learn. So there was politics involved, but it wasn't theory that like got me to really like open my eyes. Like I definitely had an aha moment where I woke up the next day and things were like, oh my God, no. Like I'm gonna approach people and the world so much differently than I did before. And that moment specifically was I think for me, entirely driven by interaction with other people that took the time to call me out my bullshit, but also stayed and also talked me through, hey, we still care about you, we still love you, we still understand you, and also what you did is really fucked up, and you should do better. But also, I'm going to be here while you do it. And I think in a way, I talk about how Gen Z has grown up for a bulk of their lives in the age of social media, where it's sad that that's how they learn a lot of information, because I learned a lot of my information in person because someone was talking to me about it or talking in front of me. And that made it so difficult for me to turn away from someone that had differing opinions because they
Yeah.
were right there, right? And they were sharing something that made sense to me, or were just sharing their personal story. And even though I didn't agree with the beliefs they held, it allowed me to understand, hey, wait, actually, I think no one's just actually talked to you, like ever, about any of these things, because that I think is why I radicalized. But it's never been politics and theory, and all of that might have helped me much later, honestly, for my own enlightenment. But I think just like a lot of other people do, I would have found my way to being the person I am and to holding the values that I hold without a lick of theory, because people gave me everything I need to know now.
Yeah. It you know it's I feel like the theory conversation like is really like a construct of an internet generation. Like again, like what you were saying, this idea of like utilizing leveraging access to knowledge or an education to access that knowledge as a something that can be wielded to justify like my politics is right, and like there's this objective truth to politics in the sense of like at the end of there's an end of the road of your political growth, and where you end or where this person is at that moment is where you end. And that's something I see particularly with anarchists, more than like other parts of the left, I think, where it's like, well, you'll when you get to anarchy, then you're like you fully matured or whatever, like you're fully politically matured, as
Yeah,
opposed to like
no.
saying like, you know what, you're 25 years old or in 28 years old, whatever, like you've got a two-thirds of your life to live before, and you're gonna change even more moving forward. Like,
Yeah, and I mean, and I think those, and that's why binaries just never help, because I think growth is like an eternal process, and as long as you are interacting with things in the world, people and nature in different forms, you're going to be incorporating information constantly. That's going to fine tune, if not change and transform, the way that you perceive and understand the world. And your political compass might help you like understand that information, but it's not ever, it shouldn't be a stagnant process.
yeah, like if you're not continuing to grow, then you're doing something wrong, and that's kind of important.
Okay.
So while she's gone for a second, if you've enjoyed this conversation, I'm gonna plug her PayPal, throw her a couple bucks because she's giving us her valuable time and chatting with us and making all of you smarter and making me smarter. And yeah, go enjoy her work. So now she's back though, so we can't plug her stuff.
So sorry, I'm home alone now, so I was like, if a phone rings, I just have to take it. Um, So yeah, I think another example that I was quickly thinking of when we talk about day-to-day application. I mean, besides, I think we've gone back to being like relationships, right? How do you interact with people? How you talk to each other? How you act in those relationships, and how you show up for each other is probably the most important thing. But then also we talked about yourself and how you look at yourself and how you examine your actions. But this whole binary, it's not just something we project onto the world, it's how we think of ourselves, and I think that's important. Like, you probably at some point had an understanding of who you are and thought that like people are good and bad, and therefore if you do a bad thing, the reason that shame is so heavy to carry is because you then think, okay, I'm a bad person. So then we do all of these things to avoid that feeling, whether that means lying or not being open and compassionate with other people who might do that same thing. That it's all a result of then you forcing yourself to fit these binaries of like productive capitalist worker versus like a quote unquote lazy, unproductive human being. Like we're all forced, like projecting whatever we put out into the world is judgments that you've placed on yourself.
Yeah.
And I think something that helped me understand is ironically thinking that I'm wrong, thinking that I don't know a lot, that I've always like had the capacity to learn more, that I might always be wrong, that someone else has something to teach me. All of these things was never uncomfortable eventually because it just meant it gave me room to be compassionate with myself. It was like actually way more liberating to let myself then make mistakes and then think, you know what, it's okay. Like as long as I learn from this moment and move on, and people in my life will still support me if I'm honest about it and open about it, and people won't resent me, and then I just, you know, move on and become a tad bit of a better human being, hopefully. So I think that oddly, I don't know why people run from that acknowledgement of like wrong or acknowledgement of so many things that we don't know, that we're always capable of learning more, because it just feels better.
Yeah, and I think we see that manifest in a lot of younger kids, like Gen Z, and I don't know what the next generation's called, but like they got to be like 14 by now. The generation that's coming up from under Gen Z. But like this idea that we can layer ourselves, we can shield ourselves, we can insulate ourselves from being wrong by using like intersectionality. And you see that manifest in like on Instagram and Facebook through like, the Instagram profile that lists like every marginalization that could exist, like,
Well, no, but
ADD,
that's
blah, blah, blah.
a real thing. Like that's a capitalist. So, and that's why I talked about like these boxes. The reason like these boxes are created, I put mental health there because diagnoses are now an identity. Um, so people basically pick the boxes that they're in and the labels that fit them, and then they define their entire sense of self with these made up concepts, right? Like like so even though race is not a real biological difference, and obviously it's shaped the way that we've interacted with the world and that we've experienced the world, ultimately forgetting though that it's not a real thing makes you then act in ways that are not actually productive in terms of like helping your community and helping the cause in general. And for example, like a big thing right now that we're seeing, and I think it's really important to mention, is and this is how capitalism works, right? Like the way control is maintained is first people in power create a made up concept and then use that made up concept to divide communities. And now, for example, the a colonial system that's a capitalist system that hasn't changed is psychiatry, and it benefits from getting people to believe that there's something fundamentally diseased and defective about them, and that it's a biological illness that makes them have these like some mental anguish and suffering and legitimate pain that they experience, as opposed to, okay, it's society that's disabling you and you live in a very crushing, brutal, oppressive society, and the responses that you're having and the pain that you're experiencing is very much so normal and expected. And in this context, in this social context, what you're experiencing is actually it's not a form of innate defect. Because then that turns to, if you actually make people feel like they're broken, then the solution to that is to pump them full of drugs that are profitable by big pharmaceutical companies that a lot of them are dependent on for the rest of their lives in different capacity, and convince them that these are like the cure, right? As opposed to the real solution being much harder, which is trying to change the social context of the society you live in to actually get yourself to be healthy. And I think that's another big identity thing that I've now seen that's fairly new, in terms of like mental health and diagnoses are entire identities, and people reduce themselves entirely to the diagnosis that they got. And it's sad because you see people defend their self-pathologization, like especially when I do posts, I'll have people in my comments be like, do not tell me that I'm not broken and defective. I'll be like because they've defined their entire identity, and they communicate their suffering using these medicalized terms that they don't know how to communicate their suffering otherwise. And the reason that is individualism, because people are so focused on them and themselves and validating themselves that they fail to, I guess, realize that a lot of the suffering that we have is shared and
Yeah.
collective. And
Yeah.
there's political language for suffering too, and that can actually lead to something meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about it from that angle. I usually think about it as like, you see these fights going on like Instagram, and like I think everyone's worried about like getting canceled and blah blah blah, and it's like, well, I'm XYZ, I can't be canceled, I'm marginalized, blah blah blah, and it's like
Yeah,
this insulatory thing so that they
it
can
never
stay in
it
that
never makes
binary of good
sense.
and bad.
Yeah, and it never makes sense when people like, so a lot of people, one of the posts I think of that was like really controversial. I mean, all of my posts on mental health, just because I talk shit about all of psychiatry and capitalist frameworks of health, and it makes people really uncomfortable when you say, hey, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with you. It's the society that's fucking you over. So maybe not define your entire sense of self with this arbitrary label. But at the end of the day, I remember this post that where I think the cover or the title or the major conclusion was, "Don't scapegoat poor white people for the oppressive systems constructed by rich, elite, wealthy white people." And that post just got so much shit. And a lot of the comments were always like, listen to Black people, listen to X person with X identity. Like, and I'm like, do you realize how illogical and slippery of a slope that is? Because I'm sure as hell not listening to Kamala Harris, and you probably aren't either. So,
You
so
have to listen to the
it's
right
never
ones. Yeah.
enough anymore. It's never enough, right? Like, or it'll just be like, especially when I'm talking about like the framework of disability, because I talk about how people inherently are not broken, defective, diseased, disordered, but a society disables them by being fundamentally inaccessible and shaping itself to be what's perfect for a capitalist worker, and to frame us as that, as opposed to thinking about, I guess, the norm right now, which is thinking about individuals, right? Individualizing problems as opposed to seeing the systemic cause. But in that context, a lot of people will just be like, listen to disabled people, listen to this person, again, just putting in identities. And I'm like, but I can guarantee you, I can find a person of any identity that has fundamental views that totally oppose everything that you believe in. And
Yeah.
that's why it's never enough anymore. Like it's
Yeah.
never enough. It never was enough, because one, these identities are not real. Two, what makes them real is the fact that we've had oppressive systems that made them real and oppressed us using them. And therefore, if you just make them real by just pretending like they're actual, real biological differences between us, then it ultimately makes it so easy for anybody to take advantage of you and exploit you, basically.
Yeah, and you see that a lot with like, you know, like land back, like is an easy one where it's like listen to indigenous people, and it's like, well, yes, but also like you have to recognize that indigenous people aren't a monolith,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to have different opinions on what land back means to them,
Mm-hmm.
and like it's just kind of a scapegoat for especially like white leftists to just be like, well, I'm washing my hands of responsibility and handing these things off
Mm-hmm.
to marginalized people after
Oh, and
like
that's why. Yep, and that's
historical. Yeah.
the like that handing off. I mean, like racism is a white problem, right? But then we always say like listen to people of color. But really what that sometimes manifests into in real life is the burden of the mantle of like change being thrust on the back of already deeply marginalized people that then have to show up at these diversity inclusion panels and like rip open their like hearts to have painful ass stories and ultimately have no real change come to their communities, right? Like that's what it
But
looks
the white
like.
people feel better.
Yes, exactly. Because listen to people of color. So it's like I think it makes us forget sometimes when we think of complex systems of power, the people that are oppressed maybe should not be carrying the burden on their back of doing all the work. But when you make everything about identity politics, that's inevitably what's going to happen. And like even the example that you gave about just like the monolith and the idea of the monolith, I think I kind of had to think about that within the framework of like if I even look around me and think of where we've moved in the past 10 or 20 years, I think we are moving closer and closer and closer to total abolition. And that's because the ideas that actually resonate with people and that bring people together and produce solidarity and build community power do eventually come out to be the ones that a lot of people believe in. And that's when you have revolutions happen, right? Like slowly and gradually. But at the same time, like, I think now we've embraced abolition, especially in terms of like carceral systems, more than ever. But that's because people eventually do get it. But in the meantime, it's like, why can't we just skip that part and just like? But sometimes we
Yeah.
can't, I guess. And I've had to be okay with that. I've had to be okay with like different people having very differing opinions, and there's a reason to that diversity. There's always a purpose to having different approaches towards a problem, and I think that's what helps me think about. I'm not the only person with all the answers. I can't possibly have that. I don't know it. I don't hold all the experiences of everybody around the world, so I can't possibly know what everybody's needs are.
Yeah.
So if I can't, then by default, that means there are going to be people that think differently than me that are also correct.
Yeah, and I think that's the scariest part is like making that space for other people to be right and for you to be right, for that what seems like incompatibility to exist and just be.
Yeah, and I think that's why it helps to think about I think about the concept of like neurodiversity, right? Like people now have made it as though it's like us versus them, even for neurodivergence. It's like neurotypical people versus like the people with the divergent brains, as as opposed to like neurodiversity literally just means there's a diversity of brains. It means everybody has a little bit of a different way of how they operate and think and how their brain is shaped, and that's a culmination of the environment they live in and of a bunch of things that happen to them as they live and experience the world. But I think diversity is like fundamentally how all of nature exists, right? Every individual being is a little bit different, but then when you have a collective and a community come together, there's a value to that diversity. If you look and I'm thinking about this in terms of the research and the science that I do, homogeneity is never good. It's never good to be one of anything, and that pretty much always has gotten you killed and extinct. So it's thinking of like ways that we can actually move towards understanding heterogeneity and seeing that as a strength as opposed to like a weakness, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I was what the hell was I reading or watching? I can't remember anymore. But it was about like neurodivergence and how it's historically existed, especially in egalitarian societies. And it was probably like an Instagram post or something, but it was about like the like neurodivergent people in like a lot of indigenous cultures here in the United States were considered to be able to speak to the spirits or gods and things like that. And it was like it was really interesting to think about like basically creating a space for people that are just simply, different. And like it's just like so different than the way we think of like functionality of people under capitalism and like
Well,
how
we
you have
do,
to
right?
have a
Because there's a
purpose.
standard. There's a
Yeah.
standard. So function, like whenever we think of what is normal, what is acceptable, and what is the standard, we define that according to the standards set by the dominant group, which in this case are the rich and the elite who have set the standard to be whatever makes you an ideal capitalist worker and whatever gets you to fit the norms. And essentially anybody that diverges from that. And the thing is, all of us can diverge from that. And all of us like do in different ways, but it's about, I think ultimately neurodiversity is really about trying to understand how you can be different and how you might actually have certain things that you do in your day to day that you can harness and that are valuable, and that can be something that you use for serving your community that just are important. And that doesn't mean you're lesser, or that doesn't mean you're and again, lesser comes from, again, what is the standard, right? Going back to like what is the benchmark that you're aspiring towards as the norm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and again, I guess this talks about like all the subjective experiences we have, but like my own daughter is autistic. So like thinking about like her place in the world we live in and versus like again other societies and the way someone like with her challenges would exist in a community. And it's a reminder of how like heartless the world we live in, like in terms of like capitalism is, and like trying to find space for people given what they have to offer.
Yeah, and I mean, we think about this. Like, I think the easiest example is like with COVID. People probably have some level of understanding of like the world of microbes. The reason that we're still fighting bacteria and viruses and parasites and fungi, not just fighting them, but also like there's a lot that we rely on, depend on in order to keep us alive. is because they're evolving with us and they're evolving and adapting to their environment constantly, and that takes diversity, where every individual cell is so different than another. And the difference, though, and this is where it helps me to think about social constructs, is bacteria don't look at each other and call a shorter cell ugly or defective or broken, or look at a longer cell and say that there's something wrong with you, right? Because they just are. And it's almost like but with humans, we assign arbitrary positive, negative connotations to absolutely everything. And because we do that, we are then forced to contend with people being different, being then put into boxes of these, matching these, well, are they positive or are they negative according to the society that we've built? But it's important to remember it's according to the society that we've built. But on their own, they would just exist.
Yeah.
And they would have whatever traits they have, but they're neutral at baseline. But I think especially when I do research and look at microbes, because I'm forced to look at them as neutral, it allows me to realize how these assignments of like social constructs are actually so destructive because they're not real.
Yeah. Once you start breaking down the way our society is constructed, it's really hard to like engage with it in a way that doesn't just make you angry. But
No, but I think in that I'm like, wait, no, but then this means that there's a way for us to continue to thrive, but it does mean that we have to inextricably adapt to our environment, and by adapt, it means literally work with our environment, work with nature, and work with our land and our resources that we have, which again, capitalism fundamentally does not do. It goes against nature, and it goes against the capacity of our planet to be able to regenerate. So if you think about what's wrong, then you can actually think about, so the solution, therefore, is to actually get rid of capitalism. It's to get rid of these binaries, is to get rid of social constructs, stop assigning positive, negative connotations to stuff. That's, I think, Praxis, right? It's like really understanding what is wrong with our world, like really getting past the lingo and the fluff and the superficial stuff. But that really goes back to understanding, okay, if someone believes in this thing, if someone believes in capitalism, if they're really, really so if they're really so invested in upholding these systems, what makes them do that? What have they been told since they were little? What makes them believe that? And how do I believe the same things? And then also, how can I undo these beliefs today in my day-to-day?
Yeah, it's a challenge, that's for sure. So for folks that are watching, does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? Still got quite a few folks. We barely lost anyone the whole hour and almost an hour and a half. So I guess people enjoyed listening. Well, while we're waiting to see if anyone else is gonna chat in, go follow Woke Scientist on Instagram. Go support Aisha's work by hitting her up on Cash App. Throw her a couple bucks. If you have already done that and you want to support us so we can keep making content, throw us a couple bucks on Patreon, or you can subscribe here on Twitch if you're watching on Twitch. If you're on Patreon, you get access to our podcast, which, if you don't know, we are a podcast. That's our main thing, but I just can't stop talking to people. So I bring people on and we talk about stuff, and I try to keep up, and it's fun. Yeah, I don't know. I guess no one else has any questions. So yeah, Aisha, this was great. I'm sure you'll be on again because we can't ever stop talking. So it's not a bad thing.
No, it's good, and I like that people. I guess this is more meaningful than 10-slide 1-minute reads of a post. That people are actually invested and they stick around and they actually get to like see the whole thing and hear the whole thing.
And get to see that you're like a real person and not just a robot that's
not
making
just a bot.
Yeah.
A leftist anarchist bot.
Yeah, no one made you in a lab, I don't think. So yeah, all right. So I guess we'll wrap up. Again, thanks so much. Go support Dr. Khan's work. Join her on Instagram, Woke Scientist, and yeah, if you missed the beginning, go hop on YouTube in like a half hour, and the first half or the rest of it will be up. So, thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, y'all.